Cast off for being crippled, she was carried home by a man who saw something else. The axle on the Dunmore wagon snapped on a Thursday, which I know because Thursday was the day Elmore Pratt ran his mouth longest at the feed store, and I'd been listening to him for the better part of an hour before I heard the crack from up the road. It wasn't a big sound, just a clean snap like a dry stick underfoot, but out on the flat sounds carry, and I walked out onto the porch to look. The wagon had gone over on its left side. One wheel was still spinning, slow and useless, the way a wheel does when it's not touching anything. Harlan Dunmore was already out of the seat and standing in the road with his hat off and his face red. His wife Cora was still up on the bench, gripping the side rail. And down in the dust, halfway under the tilted bed, was a woman I didn't recognize. Pratt came out behind me and squinted. "That'll be the Dunmore girl," he said, "Cripple one." I was already walking. Her name, I found out later, was Nora. She was Harlan's wife's younger sister, come up from Dalton to stay the season, or so the story went. She had a twisted left leg, twisted from birth, I later understood. The foot turned inward and the hip set wrong, and she walked with a wooden crutch she'd worn smooth from years of use. The crutch was still in the wagon somewhere when I got to her, and she was lying in the road dust with a cut above her eye and her dress torn at the shoulder, and she wasn't crying. I noticed that first. She wasn't crying. "Don't move," I told her. "I'm not moving," she said. She said it evenly, not sharp, just factual, the way you say something that doesn't need arguing. I checked what I could see. The leg, the bad one, was bent in a way that looked wrong, but it was hard to tell what was the injury and what was the condition she'd always had. There was blood from the cut, not a lot, and her hands were scraped. Her eyes were clear, which mattered. Harlan came around the back of the wagon. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he doesn't know how to solve and doesn't particularly want to. "Nora," he said, and stopped there. Cora climbed down and stood beside him. She had more decency than he did. She at least looked worried, but she was also pregnant, maybe 6 months, and she stayed where she was. Pratt was behind me now. He'd followed without being invited. Half the men in town were that way, curious enough to watch, not moved enough to act. I crouched down beside the woman in the road. "Tell me where it hurts," I said. She thought about it, which was the right thing to do. Not the "I'm fine, nothing hurts" reflex, not the dramatic catalog of damage. She actually thought about it. "Hip," she said, "same one, and my hand." She held up her right hand. The palm was torn up. I put it out to catch myself. "That was the right thing to do," I said. She looked at me with something in her eyes I couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, more like mild surprise that I'd said it. I got an arm under her and lifted her out of the road. She was lighter than she looked, and she didn't make a sound when I lifted her, though I felt the small stiffening through her ribs that told me it cost her. I carried her to the boardwalk in front of Pratt's store and set her down on the bench there. Harlan Dunmore said, "Obliged," from 15 feet away. I didn't answer him. My name is Callum Hess, and I had lived in Bitter Fork for going on 7 years by then. I ran a small freighting operation, 2 wagons, 4 horses, a mule named Dooley that I kept for sentiment more than use. I owned a house at the east end of town, which was the unfashionable end, and I ate my meals either at the house or at the hotel on weeks I didn't feel like cooking. I had no wife. I had no particular prospects of one. I was 44 years old that summer, with a scar along my jaw from a foolish night in my 20s that I don't need to explain, and hands that were thick and cracked from work and cold. I was not a man women looked at when they had other options. I am telling you this so you understand the shape of things. There was nothing wrong with me that I was aware of. I worked. I kept my word. I paid what I owed. I did not drink past having a drink. But in a town like Bitter Fork, if you didn't have land, real land, not a house on a lot, and you didn't have a family name that meant something, and you were past 40 and still alone, The assumption that formed around you was quiet and settled. The assumption was that you were what you appeared to be, capable enough, reliable enough, but not quite enough of anything else, not quite enough to matter much. I had learned to live inside that assumption the way you learn to live inside a coat that doesn't quite fit. You stop noticing after a while. The freighting was honest work and it suited me. I'd started it in my mid-30s after a few years of working for other men's operations, first down in the territories and then up through Kansas before finally stopping in Bitter Fork because the winters were manageable and there was no one already working the route I had in mind. I built it slow. First one wagon, then the horses, then the second wagon and the contracts with the ranches north of town. By the summer Nora Strand arrived, I had a solid operation. Nothing remarkable, but steady. Men in Bitter Fork knew my name because I moved their goods reliably and I didn't overcharge, and if I said I'd be somewhere Thursday, I was there Thursday. That was what I had built. I was not ungrateful for it. But there were evenings, long evenings in that house at the east end of town, the lamp burning and the ledger worked through and nothing left to do but sit, when I felt the weight of a life that had settled into its shape without quite filling it. Not unhappiness. I want to be precise about that. It wasn't unhappiness. It was more like a house that was properly built and correctly furnished, and that nonetheless had a particular quality of quiet that houses have when no one has lived in them for a long time. I had grown used to it so thoroughly that I stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing the wind after a while. What I noticed more, in those first few days after Nora Strand came to Bitter Fork, was how the town talked about her. Pratt said it first because Pratt always said things first, but he wasn't alone. Crippled girl, poor thing. What's Harlan going to do with her all season? She can't help much. She can barely walk. Shame, her being pretty otherwise, but what man's going to want the trouble of that? They didn't say it meanly, most of them. They said it the way people say things about weather, observable, factual, not something that required their opinion to be reconsidered. The woman had a bad leg. That was her defining feature. That was what she was. I am not telling you I was a different or better man than the rest of them. I am telling you what I saw, which was something they apparently missed. She was staying with Harlan and Cora in their house on the north side, and I saw her most mornings from the road, sitting out on their steps with a cup of something, watching the day start. She did it quietly, without restlessness. She brought a book sometimes. She seemed from a distance like a person entirely at ease with herself, which is rarer than it sounds. Most people, you watch them sitting still, there's something in them pushing against the stillness. An impatience, a need to be seen doing something. She didn't have that. She sat the way a person sits when they're comfortable in their own company. I also noticed, because I paid attention, which was not a complicated thing to do, that she was not treated well inside that house. Not badly, not cruelly, but the way you treat something that complicates your life by existing. Cora meant well but was occupied with the pregnancy and with Harlan's moods. Harlan had a short patience for anything that required extra handling, and a woman who needed help with certain tasks, who moved differently, who couldn't manage the stairs fast, who required accommodation, was extra handling as far as he was concerned. He showed it in small ways. The sigh when she asked him to reach something, the way he didn't quite look at her when she spoke, the slight impatience in his voice that he probably didn't even know was there. She bore it without complaint. That was what I kept seeing. She bore it and she did what she could do, and she did not ask anyone to feel sorry for her. About 10 days after she arrived, I ran into her in the road between the store and the post office. She was on her crutch, moving steadily, and she had a paper package under her arm that looked heavier than it was convenient to carry. She wasn't struggling with it. She'd worked out how to balance things, but it was evident that an extra hand would have been useful. I stopped. "I can take that to wherever it's going," I said. She looked at me. She had blue eyes lighter than I'd expected, and they were direct, not suspicious, just looking. "I'm going to Cora's," she said. "I'm going that direction," I said, which was approximately true. She considered and then handed me the package, not reluctantly. Just she looked at me and handed it over, a practical decision. We walked. She moved at her own pace and I matched it, which felt natural to me, though I understood it might have surprised her. Most people either rushed ahead or made a pointed display of slowing down. I did neither. "You're the freighter," she said after a moment. "Callum Hess." "Nora Strand." "I know," I said. She glanced at me. "You were there when the wagon went over." "You weren't crying," I said. That surprised her, I could see it. Not the remembering, but the thing I'd noticed. "I don't see much point in it," she said. "No," I said, "I don't either." We got to the house and I gave her back the package at the door, and she thanked me without making it into more than it was, and I walked home. I thought about her most of that evening, not in a complicated way. Just she was in my mind, the way a thing you've noticed stays with you. The directness of her eyes, the matter-of-fact way she bore the crutch and the package and the road without apology or theater. The fact that she said what was true and didn't ornament it. I went asleep and told myself that was the end of it. It wasn't, of course. The trouble started in August, or at least that's when I became aware of it. It had been building longer than that. Harlan Dunmore had a temper he kept banked down most of the time, but it had a way of surfacing under pressure, and by August the pressure was considerable. The baby was coming in October. Money was tighter than he'd expected. He'd lost a contract with a ranch up north that he'd been counting on. He came into Pratt's store one afternoon when I was there settling an account, and his face was carrying everything he wasn't saying, and I watched him be short with Pratt about something that didn't deserve it. I didn't think much of it then. Men carry things badly sometimes. I've done it myself. But the next morning I was up before first light. I always am. It's a freight man's habit. The pre-dawn hours are when the work happens, and I was walking my usual route to check on the horses, and I passed the Dunmore house, and through the front window the lamp was lit. That wasn't unusual. What stopped me was the voices. Not shouting. Harlan didn't shout. It was worse than shouting in a way. It was that low, deliberate kind of voice a man uses when he wants to make himself felt without making a scene. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the register of it, and I could hear nothing from the other person. No response, or almost none. I stood there in the dark for a moment. Then I walked on. I'm not a man who inserts himself. I never have been. What happens inside another man's house is his business, and in 1882 on the frontier that opinion wasn't peculiar to me. It was simply the law of how things worked. You didn't meddle. You minded what was yours. But I found myself minding less than I should have in the days that followed. Nora's face had changed. The ease I'd seen in her on those morning steps was more guarded now. She still came out in the mornings, but she was watchful in a way she hadn't been. She moved through town with her head lower, not because of her leg. She'd never been ashamed of that, but because of something else. Something pressing down on her from inside the house she was living in. I caught myself watching for her, not in a way I'd have wanted anyone to see or that I was particularly proud of. Just awareness, the way you keep track of something that matters. One afternoon in the second week of August, she came into the store when I was there, and I saw the bruise. It was on her forearm, just below the elbow, half covered by her sleeve but not entirely. Old enough to be yellowing at the edges. She saw me see it and she adjusted her sleeve and her face didn't change. I bought a bolt of rope I didn't need and went home. That night I made a decision. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one. Just a quiet internal settlement, the kind you make when you've already known something for a while and finally admit it to yourself. This was going to have to be addressed. I turned it over for 2 days. I turned it over the way I used to turn over cargo problems when I was starting out. What's the weight? What's the load capacity? What's the road between here and there? What can I actually do, given the terrain? The terrain was this. She was Harlan's sister-in-law, living under his roof, with no money of her own and no arrangements made elsewhere, and no one in Bitter Fork who had any particular claim on her welfare. Harlan had not broken any law that anyone would act on. Cora was pregnant and dependent, and not in a position to stand against her husband even if she'd had the clarity to see what was happening, which I was not certain she did. And Nora herself had said nothing, asked nothing, showed nothing. A man without standing, going to Harlan Dunmore and saying take better care of your wife's sister, would have accomplished nothing except to make Harlan's mood worse and Nora's situation harder. I needed standing. I thought about it until I had something that might work. I went to see Harlan Dunmore on a Sunday, which was deliberate. Sunday mornings were when Cora went to the women's prayer circle, which met at the pastor's wife's house 3 streets over. Nora usually went with her, but that morning I'd seen her staying back. She'd looked tired. So I went and knocked on the door when I was reasonably certain Harlan was the only one home. He opened the door and looked at me with the flat expression of a man who doesn't want visitors. "Hess," he said. "Harlan," I kept my voice easy. "I've got a proposition for you, and I think you'll find it's to your advantage." He let me in, because a man with money troubles generally lets in anyone who mentions an advantage. I sat down at his table. He didn't offer coffee, which told me the mood. "I need a housekeeper," I said. "Someone who can cook and manage the house. I've been living like a bachelor long enough, and I've got the money to pay for the help." He studied me. "Your sister-in-law," I said. "She's capable and she's steady, and she needs something useful to do." The look on his face went through several things quickly. Calculation, a flicker of something defensive, then calculation again. "Nora can't," he started. "She can cook," I said. "She can clean. She reads, which means she can manage accounts and correspondence. Her leg doesn't stop any of that." "She's a burden," he said, and he said it the way you state a weather report. "She requires extra." "I'm not asking you to take her along on a cattle drive," I said. "I'm asking to pay her wages to do work she can do. That's one less person under your roof before the baby comes." That landed. I'd thought it would. He drummed his fingers on the table twice. "What kind of wages?" he said. I named a figure. It was a fair figure, more than fair, and I could see him doing the arithmetic. I watched his face settle into agreement. "She'd need to board somewhere," he said. "I've got a room," I said. "The house is big enough." He gave me a look at that, not protective, which would have been justified, but something more like trying to work out if there was a profit angle he was missing. "You'd keep it decent," he said. "I've kept everything I've ever had decent," I said. He agreed. We shook on it. He looked, if I'm honest, relieved. I went back to my house and stood in the kitchen for a while, looking at the space. It was not a bad house. It was plain and it was clean, and it had a window over the sink that faced east, so the morning light came in good. The room I'd indicated was off the back hall, smaller than mine, but it had a sound door that locked from the inside and its own window, and a decent iron bed frame that had come with the place. I put clean linens on the bed, and I put a lamp on the table by the window, and I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. There was a small rag rug on the floor that I'd bought years ago at a trader's and never quite known what to do with. I left it where it was. Then I went to find Nora. She was on the steps when I came around the side of the Dunmore house. She had the book in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. She was watching something in the middle distance, though there wasn't much there to watch. I sat down on the step below her, where I wouldn't be looking down at her. "I spoke to Harlan," I said. She went still, not afraid. She wasn't a woman who frightened easily, just attending. I told her the arrangement. I kept it plain. She would cook and manage the house and I would pay her wages. She would have her own room with a lock. She would not be a guest or a charity case. She would be a working woman with a fair arrangement and her own money. She looked at me while I talked, those light eyes steady and direct. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I started to wonder if I'd read it all wrong. Then she said, "Why?" Not a question exactly, more like she was checking my account of it. "Because you need out of this house," I said, "and I need the help, and both things are true." She was quiet again. "The arrangement will be decent," I said. "I'll conduct myself accordingly." "I know you will," she said. And the way she said it, not like a guess, but like something she'd already worked out and confirmed, settled something in me I hadn't known was unsettled. She said she'd come the next morning. I went home and made a meal and ate it and went to bed, and somewhere around midnight it occurred to me that the house was going to be different in the morning, and I lay there in the dark with that thought for a while. It was a strange feeling, not a bad one, something more like the feeling the night before you set out on a long haul, the sense that what was coming was going to require something from you that you were not entirely certain you had. I fell asleep eventually. The horses were quiet. The town was quiet. The whole end of the world I occupied was quiet, the way it gets when something is about to change. The first week was quiet. We found our way around each other the way people do when the space is new and the terms aren't fully defined yet, politely, with extra care, without getting in each other's way. She was a good cook. Better than I'd expected, not that I'd expected much one way or the other. She had opinions about it, about how things should be done, what went with what, and she didn't hide them, which I found I liked. She didn't talk much while she worked, but when she said something it tended to be worth hearing. The house itself responded to her, in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was clean before she came, but it had been a bachelor's clean, functional, without warmth. Within a few days there was something different about it. Small things. The way she arranged what was on the windowsill. The fact that she put something on the table in the evenings that wasn't strictly necessary but made the room feel more inhabited. She wasn't performing domesticity for me. She was just making a place livable, because that was her nature. I tried not to watch her. I wasn't always successful. She moved through the house in a particular way, the crutch fitting itself to the space as though it had always belonged there. She knew how to use a doorframe as an extra point of support, how to position herself at the counter so she could work with two hands. She had solved herself years before I met her. Whatever solutions she'd built them alone, and they were good ones. I noticed small things. The coffee was always ready before I came in from the morning check on the horses. Not because she rose early for me, she rose early herself. She set 2 cups without being asked, after the first morning when I'd poured the second cup myself. She mended a shirt of mine that had a torn cuff without mentioning it, just folded it back on top of my things. If something in the house needed fixing, a loose hinge, a window that stuck, she would try to work it out herself first, and only tell me about it if she couldn't manage. Not out of pride, I think, but because she was used to solving problems with what she had. I respected that. More than respected it. It was a quality I recognized in the way you recognize a tool that's been made right. There's a satisfaction in encountering something genuinely competent. In the evenings we sometimes sat. The kitchen had the best light and she'd read, and I'd work on accounts or go over cargo manifests or sometimes do nothing at all, which was something I rarely did. She didn't require conversation and neither did I, and the silence between us was easy. That's not a small thing. I had lived in enough silences by that point to know the difference between one that's comfortable and one that isn't. There was an evening in the second week when I came in from a late run. I'd had a load to deliver to the Callahan Ranch, and the road back was rough, and I was tired in that particular flat way you get when the day has gone longer than the body had budgeted for, and the house smelled of something cooking that I didn't recognize. Something with spices in it. She was at the stove. She turned when I came in. "Sit down," she said. "It's almost done." I sat down. I didn't have much argument in me at that hour. She put a plate in front of me. Whatever it was had peppers in it, and something that tasted like it had been cooked long and slow, the way things taste when someone has paid attention to them. I ate most of it before I said anything. "What is this?" I said. "Something my mother made," she said. "Missouri style more or less. I didn't have everything she used." "It's good," I said. She looked at the plate, not at me, and there was something in her face, not pleasure at the compliment exactly, but something more like relief. Like she'd been waiting to see if the thing she'd made was worth making. "She used to make it in winter," she said. "I haven't made it in years." I didn't say anything to that, but I finished the plate. Toward the end of the first week she said, "You're different than I thought you'd be." We were at the table after supper. I looked up from the ledger. "How did you think I'd be?" I said. She considered it. "I'm not sure, more careful with me. More demonstrating something." "I'm not demonstrating anything," I said. "No," she said, "that's what I mean." I went back to the ledger, and she went back to her book, and neither of us said anything else about it. The town noticed, of course. Towns notice everything, and Bitter Fork was no exception. The opinions were several. There were people who thought it was charity, that I'd taken her in out of pity, which was uncharitable to both of us. There were people who thought it was something less respectable than that, which was inaccurate and irritating. Pratt, characteristically, managed to voice both opinions in the same breath one afternoon when I was at the counter, framing them both as concern. "Decent thing," he said, with that particular inflection that made decent sound like anything but. "Poor girl, she needs something to do, though people will talk, of course. Man your age, woman living in." "Pratt," I said. He looked at me. "Mind your store," I said. There was a silence. He blinked twice and went back to sorting something behind the counter, and I took my goods and left. It was not the most eloquent thing I'd said in my life, but it settled him, and the talk in the store quieted after that. Not because anyone had changed their opinion, but because they understood I wasn't going to tolerate it, and in a town where I moved half the goods that kept the commerce running, tolerance of my position had a certain practical dimension. There was another opinion in town, which was from Doc Alderman, who was a more useful man than most. He stopped me on the road one afternoon and told me he'd looked in on Nora at my request. I'd asked him quietly early on to check her hip, which she wouldn't have asked for herself, and that she was all right. The bruising from the wagon fall had healed properly, and that the leg was what it was, which was to say permanent and not likely to worsen if she didn't do foolish things to it. "She's a sensible woman," he told me. "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment with the look a doctor gets when he's seeing something that isn't quite his business, but that he can't quite stop seeing. "Good thing you did," he said, and moved on. I did not require his approval, but I found I didn't mind having it. It was a Saturday in September when it came to a head. Harlan Dunmore had been drinking. Not heavily. Harlan wasn't a drunk, that much was true, but enough. He came to my door in the middle of the afternoon, which in itself told me something about where his head was, because sober Harlan would have known better. I opened the door and saw him standing on the step. He had his hat in his hands, which meant he'd started the visit with some intention of being civil. "I want to talk to Nora," he said. "About what?" I said. "That's between me and her." Nora had come out of the kitchen. She'd heard the knock. She was standing at the end of the hall, crutch in hand, and she was looking at Harlan with an expression that was steady and not afraid, but also not easy. I stepped slightly to my left, not quite filling the doorway, just present. "She's working," I said. She's my employee," I said. "She's working. If you have something you need to say to her, write it down and leave it with me and I'll see she gets it." He stared at me for a long moment. The way a man does when he's trying to figure out how much a thing is going to cost him. I kept my face neutral. I was not interested in making this bigger than it was, and I was not interested in making it smaller either. I had a door and I was standing in it, and that was the whole thing. He looked past me at Nora. She didn't move and she didn't speak. She held his look for a moment and then she looked back down the hall, unhurried, the way you look away from something that no longer has much claim on you. That, I think, was what finished it for him. He left. He didn't say another word. He turned and went back down the step and walked away, and I watched him go until he was around the corner. When I turned around, Nora was still at the end of the hall. She was looking at me, and her face had something in it I didn't know how to name exactly. It wasn't surprise, not exactly. It was more like recognition. The way you look at something when you've hoped for it long enough that seeing it real is its own kind of adjustment. "He'll go to Cora," she said. "Let him," I said. "Cora's a sensible woman when she has the room to be. She doesn't have much room right now, but she'll have it eventually." Nora didn't say anything to that. I went back to what I'd been doing. She went back to the kitchen. After a while I heard her moving around in there, and the particular sounds of supper being started, the weight of the pan on the iron, the water from the pump, the small clean percussion of her working at what she knew how to do. It was the most ordinary afternoon. I thought about that for a long time afterward. How ordinary it was, and how unlike anything ordinary I had experienced in a good many years. What came after was quieter than I expected. Harlan made his displeasure known through channels, through Pratt, through a word dropped here and there, but it didn't amount to much. Men in Bitter Fork might have their opinions about me taking Nora in, but most of them also knew what I was, which was reliable and solvent, and not a man who got drawn into other people's quarrels without cause. The fact that I'd given her cause, that I'd stood in that doorway, filtered through town in the way these things do, and the filtering left a certain residue of respect that Harlan's complaints didn't entirely dissolve. A freight man has leverage in a small town that people sometimes forget about. I moved goods. I had contracts with half the merchants on the main street. I had contracts with 3 ranches. The simple fact of my existing in Bitter Fork made me harder to dismiss than a single quarrel with Harlan Dunmore was worth. I'm not telling you I was powerful. I'm telling you I was not nothing. Nora, for her part, settled in, not just into the house but into town. She had been invisible before in the way that people who are defined by one thing are invisible. You see the crutch and you stop seeing everything else. But she was visible now, or she became visible. She went to the store and she went to the post office, and sometimes she sat out front on the bench in the afternoon and read, and people talked to her. Not all of them, but enough. Doc Alderman's wife had her for tea twice. The woman who ran the dry goods had a book recommendation. She'd been trying to get to the right person for months. She had opinions about books, it turned out. She had opinions about a lot of things, given the space to have them. I sat across from her at the supper table one evening in late September and listened to her explain, at some length, what she thought was wrong with the way the preacher was reading a particular biblical passage, and what she thought he should have said instead, and I ate my supper and let her talk, and I thought, here is a person who has been told to be smaller than she is, for a long time, and the smallness doesn't fit her any better than a coat 3 sizes wrong. She had a way of arguing that I found I enjoyed, not combative, not trying to win, but following the thing through to where it actually went. She'd read widely, more widely than I had, and she wore the reading lightly. She didn't use what she knew as a weapon or a display. She just used it, the way you use any tool that's been broken improperly. "You're smiling," she said. "Am I?" said. "What's funny?" "Nothing," I said. "Nothing's funny." She looked at me for a moment with those light eyes. "You could say what you're thinking," she said. "I won't take offense at it." "I was thinking," I said, "that you have a good mind and people have been wasting it." She went still, Not the way you go still when something lands wrong. The other way. That's a plain thing to say, she said. It's a plain thing that's true, I said. She looked down at her plate and then back up at me. And I will not dress it up more than it was, she blinked once quickly, and then her face settled back into its usual steadiness, and she went on eating. We didn't speak much more that evening, but the silence after it was different than it had been before. Warmer, maybe. More settled, the way a room feels when a window has been opened and then closed again and the air has changed. The leaves had turned by the time anything else happened. October was cold that year, coming in hard and early, the mornings frosted and the afternoons not much better. I had 3 loads to run in the first 2 weeks of the month, and I was up before light every day and in late. She left supper for me when I wasn't back in time, covered on the back of the stove, and once when I came in past 9 and the fire had burned low, she'd left a lamp lit in the kitchen and a note on the table that said, "Soup on the left, biscuits in the cloth." The handwriting was clear and even the letters well formed. A person's handwriting tells you things. Hers said, organized, certain, no wasted motion. I sat at the table and ate the soup, which was good, and listened to the house settle in the cold, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, which I won't call by its name here because I was still working out what to do with it. Cora Dunmore had the baby on the 14th, a boy. They named him after Harlan's father, which I gathered was a complicated honor, but Harlan wanted it done, and in that house what Harlan wanted was what happened. Nora went to see Cora and the baby, and she came back in the afternoon with a quietness on her face that might have been several things. Gladness for Cora, I thought, and something else, some private ledger being reconciled, the arithmetic of where she had been a season ago versus where she was now. I didn't ask. But that evening she came and sat across from me without her book, and we talked for 2 hours about things. I don't remember the specifics of the history of the territory. A river she'd seen once in childhood, horses, whether there was any point in Bitter Fork getting a telegraph, what she thought the winter was going to do. And at the end of it she was the person she was in the mornings, easy and present, and I understood that the talking had been what was needed. And I was glad I had been there to be talked to. She was not a woman who needed saving. I want to be clear about that. She was a woman who needed room and decent treatment, and a place where the thing that she was could exist without being an inconvenience. Those are not the same as needing saving. What I gave her was the room. What she did in it was entirely her own. But I will tell you that watching her do it, watching her become, over those weeks, more fully herself, more at ease, more present, did something to me. Made me feel useful in a way that had nothing to do with freighting. Made me feel that the house I'd been living in alone for 7 years had been waiting for something and had finally got it. Not waiting for a woman exactly, though that's how it sounds and I can't make it sound otherwise. Waiting for the particular person who fit the space. Who filled the silences right. Who made the morning different in the way that matters. I was also aware, without wanting to be, that the arrangement had a natural end. She was there as an employee. The season would turn. Cora would need help with the baby, and Harlan's situation would stabilize, and there would be pressure for her to return. Or she would save enough of her wages to make other arrangements, or something else would come along that I couldn't foresee. The situation had a logic to it, and the logic didn't guarantee anything. I thought about that on a cold Tuesday morning, moving hay in the barn before light, dully breathing steam beside me, the cold settling in my hands, and I thought, I am going to have to say something. Before she goes, or before the thing shifts in a way I can't control. I am going to have to say what is true. I was not good at that. I had not had practice. Years alone will do that to you. You learn to keep your accounts in your own ledger, never in anyone else's. The habit of disclosure atrophies. You forget there are people worth the risk of it. I went in from the barn and the house was warm and smelled of coffee, and I stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her for a moment before she heard me, and I thought, there it is. There is what I have been missing, and I have been missing it longer than I knew. The occasion arranged itself, which I've always thought was the way of things that are meant to happen. It was a Friday in late October, the last good light day before a storm that was coming down from the north. I had the wagons loaded and secured, and the horses taken care of, and I came inside at 4 in the afternoon, which was early for me, and she was at the table with 2 cups of coffee already poured. She looked at the door when I came in and then at the cups. "I heard you come around the back," she said. I hung my coat and sat down. The coffee was good. It was always good. "I need to say something," I said. She looked at me and waited. "I don't want this to end," I said. "The arrangement, you being here, I have enough plain sense to know that what I want isn't the arrangement. The arrangement is a reason I gave us both to try this. What I want is you here, you specifically, permanent if you'd have it." I said it and then I stopped. My hands were around the coffee cup. I could feel the heat of it. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I know what I am," I said into the silence. "I'm past 40. I've got a freight business and a house on the wrong end of town, and a mule I'm too sentimental to get rid of. I'm not a young man, and I've never been a handsome one. I know what I've got to offer is a specific kind of life in a specific kind of place, and it's not everyone's idea of." "Callum," she said. I stopped. She was looking at me with those steady, light eyes. The cup was in both her hands. Outside the window, the sky was the color that comes before a storm, dark at the edges and pale in the middle, the light going flat and strange. "You know what I am," she said. It wasn't a question, but I answered it like one. "I know what you are," I said. "You're the most capable person in this house and one of the more capable people in this town, and you've been told something different for long enough that you've probably started to half believe it. I don't believe it. I haven't believed it since the first morning I saw you." Something moved across her face. Not the blinking down kind, not the controlled kind. Something that moved and then settled, like water finding its level. "I'm not going to be easy," she said. "I have opinions." "I know," I said. "I like your opinions. I'll want to do things my own way." "I know that too." "And the leg is part of you," I said. "The same as my hands are part of me. I don't need you to be other than you are. I need you to be what you are, which is plenty." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she set her cup down and she reached across the table, and she put her hand over my hand, which was the first time she'd touched me since I'd lifted her out of the road 3 months before. Her hand was warm and small, and she held mine with a sureness that was entirely her. She said, "All right." Just that. I turned my hand over and held hers back, and we sat there in the kitchen while the light changed outside and the storm came in across the prairie, the first drops hitting the window, and she didn't take her hand away, and neither did I. The lamp between us burned on. The storm moved in and took the last of the day's light. Outside it was cold and getting colder, and in here the coffee was going cool in the cups, and neither of us moved to do anything about it. The storm ran 3 days. I mention it not because it matters to what happened, but because it was there, a real thing. 3 days of hard weather with the wind shaking the windows and the cold coming in under the doors, no matter what you packed against them. We were inside together for 3 days, and it was not difficult. That surprised me in a way. I had been alone so long I'd started to wonder if I was built for it. The way some men are. Some men need the space of a solitary life, and others just end up in it by accident. 3 days inside with another person showed me which I was. She read. I worked through accounts and fixed things that had been needing fixing. A cabinet door that hadn't sat right in 2 years. A section of windowsill that had started to rot at the corner. The loose iron bracket on the woodbox that I'd been stepping around for longer than I could account for. Small repairs. The kind of work you do when you're not going anywhere and you've got the time to do the thing properly. We cooked together, which was new, and I discovered that she was exacting in the kitchen in a way she'd never shown when cooking alone, with opinions about the sequence of steps and the precise amount of certain things that I found more interesting than irritating. I had learned to cook adequately, the way a man alone learns most things adequately, which is to say well enough to survive the need. She cooked the way someone does who has thought about it. She'd tell me what she was doing and why, not to instruct me but because she was working through the thing in her head as she did it, and the talking was part of the working. I found I didn't mind being included in her thinking. On the second night she told me about where she'd grown up, which was a farm in Missouri, and about her mother, who'd died young, and about the sister, Cora, who'd been the pretty one and the easy one, the one who drew men without trying. She told it plainly, without self-pity, the way she told most things. She talked about her father, too, who had been a decent man with a limited imagination, who'd loved her in his way but hadn't known what to do with a daughter who couldn't do certain things he'd expected daughters to do. The way she described him was neither bitter nor sentimental, just accurate. He was what he was, and she had made her peace with it. "And you," she said when she'd finished, "how did you end up here?" So I told her. The younger years, the freight work, the restlessness that had brought me west, and then the different kind of restlessness that had made me stay. The foolish night that had given me the scar, she'd asked about it once indirectly, and I'd put her off, but now I told her because I didn't want to have put her off about anything. The years that accumulated without quite adding up to what I'd meant for them to add up to, and the slow making of peace with that. She listened the way she always did, fully, without hurry. "You've had a good life," she said when I'd wound down. "I thought about that, parts of it," I said. "The parts that are left are the good ones," she said. I looked at her across the table. The lamp between us was burning low and her face was in the warm edge of it, and she was looking at me without performance, just seeing. Not the crutch leaning against the chair beside her, not the leg, me, whatever I was as I was. "I believe that," I said. "Good," she said, "hold on to it." We married in November, in the pastor's front room, with Doc Alderman and his wife as witnesses. It was a small affair, which was what we wanted. Cora came with the baby, Harlan stayed home. I didn't miss his presence. I will tell you what I remember about that morning, which is specific things. The way the room smelled, old paper and wood smoke, and the cold that came in every time the door opened. The way she stood beside me, steady and upright, the crutch at her side. She had put on a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before, and her hair was different, pinned differently, and she looked like herself but the best version, not dressed up to be something else. Just her, with the extra care she reserved for things that mattered. The pastor's voice going through the words. Her hand when she put it in mine, the sureness of it. She didn't hold it loosely, the way some women hold a man's hand in a ceremony, as if they're not entirely certain. She held it, and I felt the intention of it. And the moment she turned to me afterward in the cold air outside the pastor's house, with the winter light flat and pale around us and her breath making small clouds, and she looked at me with a look I have spent years since trying to find the right word for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that. Something more settled than happiness. Something that said, I chose this. I'm not afraid of it. I know what it is and I want it. She leaned up and kissed me on the cheek, and I stood in the cold November air and felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, that the life I was living had gotten to where it was supposed to be. Doc Alderman shook my hand. His wife put her arm around Nora for a moment, and I saw Nora's hand come up to the woman's back in return, and there was something in that small gesture, receiving warmth, giving it back, knowing how, that told me she had been waiting for a long time to have people around her who deserved it. I would not make her wait any more, for anything she deserved. 7 years we had, 7 years in that house on that end of town. The freight business grew, which surprised me. I took on a third wagon and a hired man named Erskine, who was young and earnest and made more mistakes his first year than I'd made in my first decade, but who learned from them and became, eventually, reliable. For a while I had a contract with the Territory Land Office that made the winters easier. The town grew too, which was mixed news the way town growth always is. Some good people came in and some difficult ones, and the main street changed its face twice. Pratt eventually sold his store to a man named Calhoun, who was an improvement in every measurable way. Dooley died in the third year. I took it harder than I'd have admitted to most people. She knew, and she let me take it hard without commentary, which was the right thing. She didn't tell me it was just a mule or that I'd get another one. She didn't say anything at all for a day or two. Then she said, simply, that Dooley had been a good animal and had earned his years, and that was enough. She found her work too, which was teaching. There had never been a proper school in Bitter Fork, and when the push finally came to build one, she was the obvious choice to run it, being the most educated person in town who didn't have a separate occupation. The school board had some hesitation at first, small town boards being what they are, always finding the wrong thing to hesitate about, but Doc Alderman was on the board and he did not hesitate, and his opinion carried weight enough to settle the others. She taught for 4 years. She was a demanding teacher by all accounts, and she turned out students who could read and cipher and think in complete sentences, which was more than could be said for the generation before them. Several of those children did things with their lives that wouldn't have been possible without what she'd put in them. That's a particular kind of legacy, and she carried it quietly. I went to watch the school once, through the window, without her knowing. She was at the board, writing something, and the children were watching her the way children watch a person they're not afraid of but that they respect, which is the right way to watch a teacher. She said something I couldn't hear and 2 of the children laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of them, and she smiled at that, and the lamp in the room made everything gold. I went home and started supper. I did not need her to know I'd watched. Some things you keep for yourself. Some satisfactions are private ones and the better for it. I am telling you this from the winter side of things, which is where old men tell their stories. She is in the next room. I can hear her moving around, the particular sound of her crutch on the floorboards that I know as well as I know my own heartbeat now. Better, maybe. Your own heartbeat you can't hear most of the time. Hers I've been hearing for years and it doesn't go unnoticed. I think about the morning in the road. The wheel still spinning, her lying in the dust not crying. I think about what Pratt said, cripple one, and about the way men like Pratt look at the world, seeing what's missing and cataloging it and moving on, what they can't do for you, what they'll cost you, the math of diminishment that some people run automatically, like breathing. I saw something different. I don't know if I can explain what exactly. I saw a person bearing her life without apology, and I thought, that's a quality worth more than anything the town is going to give her credit for. I was right. I've been right about other things too in my life and wrong about plenty. But I was right about that, and it has mattered more than most things I've been right about. There's a particular thing that happens in a marriage in the years of it that I did not expect and that I don't think anyone tells you about. The person you chose becomes so woven into the fabric of how you experience the world that you stop being able to separate the choosing from the having. You can't find the edge anymore. The house without her in it is not something you can quite imagine. The morning without that sound, the crutch on the floor, the coffee starting, is not a morning that makes sense to you. That sounds like dependency, and maybe it is. I don't believe it's a weakness. I believe it's the evidence that you chose right. She chose me. A woman with more sense than anyone had given her credit for, and more will than the town had ever let her use, looked at what I was past 40, scarred, a freighter on the wrong side of town, nothing remarkable, and chose. Not because she had no options. She had options. She chose because she saw something, and what she saw was worth choosing. I think about that on the hard days. The days when the work is difficult or the body doesn't do what I need it to do or the world is being the world, which it does without apology. I think she saw something. Whatever it was, she was not wrong about it. And a man who has been seen clearly by a woman of good judgment, really seen, without the flattery or the softening, carries that. It holds. I think a man could carry that a long time. I know I have. She called from the other room just now. Supper. The particular way she says it, that means it's ready and not to dawdle, which is more than fair. I'm going in. The lamp is on in the kitchen. I can see the light under the door. That's the whole story.